We are recording this podcast on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We wish to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend our respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may be listening.
Hi everyone, I'm Priscilla.
And I'm Elise.
Welcome to Novel Feelings, where we discuss representations of mental health issues in fiction novels.
So this is actually us recording a couple of weeks/months after we recorded the original review episode here. So popping in from the future, just to kind of let you guys know that we recorded our review episodes out of order, as a lot of podcasters do. And we decided later on that this would actually be the best fit for our final episode for season 2. So that's why we kind of just launch into it without mentioning that at the start. So this is us mentioning it now.
We thought that this would be a nice episode to end on because we think it's of high quality.
Give it an A+.
Yes.
Really, we're happy with how this review turned out. It is a bit of a sad book that we finish on, but we think it's a bittersweet story and really beautiful story. So yeah, we just thought it would be a nice one to finish up.
Yeah.
And I will note that we are going to record a wrap-up episode as well, a season 2 wrap-up. So that's going to go out in a few weeks' time as well. So we'll be reflecting on season 2, our reviews so far, and giving you guys a bit of an indication about what to expect from the future.
Yeah, and we also have other content coming up as well. We have actually been writing review posts on our website. So if you haven't checked out our website yet, go do that now, maybe.
Yep. Yep. Go to novelfeelings.com. So yeah, we've been kind of experimenting with writing some actual full-length written reviews. Normally the content on our website are just our show notes, so summaries of our episodes and links to further reading and resources. But it's a lot quicker turnaround for us if we read a book that we think is really interesting and want to write a review, as opposed to the whole editing process, which takes a little bit longer.
Absolutely.
Anyway, without further ado, please enjoy our final review episode for season 2, A Monster Calls, featuring our special guest, Mat Larkin. Welcome so much, Matt. We're really pleased to have you here. Would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes. Hello, Elise. Hello, Priscilla. Thank you so much for having me. Very excited to be here. So, yeah, I'm Mat Larkin. I write for children, and I've written in the mental health field before. So I have a novel out called The Orchard Underground, which is for middle grade kids, and I've got 2 more on the way.
How exciting.
So exciting. No, we'll say it at the end of the episode, but I'll say it now as well. Everybody go out and please read/buy The Orchard Underground. It's fantastic. And
I agree.
Everyone will listen to it. Great. So would you like to tell us a little bit more about what your series is about?
Yeah, so it's a kind of loosely linked series of books that all sort of happen in the same universe and have a few characters that follow through, but you could pick up any book at any point and get started. So The Orchard Underground, which is just out, is about a boy called Pre-Coley who lives in sort of one of those brand new estates that they're building right on the very edge of town. It's a new town. It's only been there about 10 years, and he was the very first kid to live in the very first house that ever existed there. And little by little, they've been building the town around him. And that means that he's been losing all of his kind of green, wild play space to more grey suburbia. And now there's only one little wedge of town that's green and untamed and wild left. And on the very last night before the bulldozers are due to go in, the newest kid in town, a girl called Attica Stone, grabs him and drags him into this area to explore it. And they find in there something magical that needs saving. And the bulldozers are arriving at dawn.
Fantastic. And you're currently working on the next book in the series, which is the first book in the series. Is that right?
I know. I've made this confusing for myself, but I went backwards to tell, for the second book, I went to tell the story of how Attica Stone, that new kid in town, got there. What is she doing there? She tells a story in Orchard Underground about why she ended up in this town, but she's actually not telling the truth. And so the second book, The Chameleon Thief, which is coming in March 2022 next year, that book is about me forcing her to tell the truth. How did you get here? What did you do? And it's the story about why a kid would not steal a chameleon but claim that she did.
Right.
Okay, I'm already intrigued. So.
The subtitle is, what would you do? How far would you go to save your worst enemy?
Ooh.
Ooh, I like it.
Yeah.
You've mentioned as well that you've previously worked in mental health writing. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience that you've had as well?
Yeah, I was a freelance writer for a lot of years, doing various different jobs, and started picking up some work in the mental health field through people that I knew who just needed a little bit of work done, a bit of polish here and there. And then was hired to work at Origin Youth Health. That was a really, really great experience. Coincided with my own mental health experience. So I had some episodes of depression and anxiety and PTSD, and it just made me even more passionate about it. Went away to then finish the Orchard Underground, and when I finished it, I had a little gap, and so I came back and started working with Sane Australia, writing fact sheets and guides and plain English language translations of research. And I have a real passion for people telling their own stories. So, you can get an expert in to write some copy and it will read all flashy, but it sometimes comes out a little empty because it might not have the actual experience of the person who's lived the thing themselves, and that nothing substitutes for that.
Sounds awesome.
And I was put in a very lucky position in the end between choosing to be a mental health writer or choosing to be a children's writer. And I took the children's one because I think I've wanted that longer.
Yeah.
I've wanted that since I was a little kid. And so, I decided to let my little kid self get what he wanted.
Fair enough. Yeah.
We don't all get an opportunity to follow our dreams, so why not take it when you can?
Well, exactly.
Love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so Matt is joining us today for our review. So what book are we reviewing today?
We are reviewing A Monster Calls by Patrick Ness.
Yay. Get ready for some tears, everybody.
Yes. This book, you guys.
Yes, this book destroys me, but we'll get to that later down the track. Before we get started on the review itself, a couple of quick disclaimers. So first of all, we are a spoiler podcast. So if you don't want to know what happens in A Monster Calls, good idea to tune out now. Secondly, I'll just note this podcast should not be taken as therapeutic advice. And finally, we're speaking today as psychologists, mental health professionals / book lovers, not necessarily from lived experience. So we acknowledge our voices are limited. Stay tuned at the end of this episode for some more information about some of the issues we cover, including perspectives from people with lived experience.
Cool. So just a little bit about the author. Patrick Ness is an award-winning novelist, and he has written for England's Radio 4 and Sunday Telegraph, and is a literary critic for The Guardian. He has written many books, including the Chaos Walking trilogy, A Monster Calls, and most recently, Burn. He has won numerous awards, including the Guardian Children's Fiction Prize, the Book Trust Teenage Prize, and the Costa Children's Book Award. Born in Virginia, he currently lives in London. A Monster Calls was adapted into a film in 2017, and the Chaos Walking film was released in 2021.
The Chaos Walking trilogy is one of my favorite trilogies of books ever. I think it's one of the most extraordinary achievements. It's almost a 3-book single chase sequence. It's so exciting and has so much forward momentum and yet so much deep heart to it.
Yeah. Look, one of the things I love about the series is how it addresses sort of toxic masculinity and, the way that this society in particular pressures boys and men in particular to hold down all their feelings and emotions, even though their thoughts are on complete display for everybody.
No spoilers.
Okay, so let's just quickly recap what happens in A Monster Calls. So Connor has the same dream every night ever since his mother first fell ill, ever since she started the treatments that don't quite seem to be working. But tonight is different. Tonight, when he wakes, there's a visitor at his window. It's ancient, elemental, a force of nature, and it wants the most dangerous thing of all for Connor. It wants the truth.
Mm.
Wow. Yeah.
So pretty vague synopsis that we get from Goodreads and so on.
Yeah.
But what's this book really about? I'll say grief.
Yeah.
It's really about grief, isn't it?
Yeah, there is all these twining elements about grief and stories and voices and fairness. There are so many different Oh God, I have a million things to say at once about it, but there are so many different twining little threads. But in the end, yes, it is about grief and anticipatory grief, which doesn't get talked about very much. Grief for somebody who isn't gone yet.
Absolutely. And that was, I suppose, the key reason why we chose this book in the first place, is wanting to really talk about a portrayal of grief like this. Not that we think grief is necessarily a quote-unquote mental health issue, but it is something that affects our well-being in our day-to-day lives in a really significant way. And I wanted to talk about, there's many books and many examples of grief in literature, but I think for a middle grade book, this is a particularly interesting example as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this would be our first middle grade book as well, at least on the podcast. Our previous season focused more on YA or adult novels.
The distinction between YA and middle grade is a little bit arbitrary. And because our character here is 13 years old, unless I'm mistaken, I'm sure he's 13, he would be right on the cusp between what's considered middle grade and what's considered YA. And this book often gets shelved on either of the two shelves. And I would have no problem with that. I think it's appropriate for upper primary school age kids, especially ones who are a little bit more kind of emotionally connected. But definitely, I mean, I felt this way when I was 13 years old and I wasn't in Connor's situation, where everybody is telling you what to feel and that, what to think, and you both a lot is expected of you, but at the same time you don't have the responsibility and power to direct your own life. So you feel trapped in two different ways.
Absolutely. And the distinction between middle grade, young adult and adult fiction is always very blurry to me, and I always appreciate a book that really transcends those labels, and I think this is probably one of them. And interestingly, this is originally a story by Siobhan Dowd as well, which Patrick Ness finished after Siobhan's death in 2007 from breast cancer. So she was a British children's writer and activist as well. And Patrick Ness was able to pick this up and finish some of the work that she started, which I think was really lovely. And not something that gets to happen all the time. Not all stories get to be finished. So whether or not this would have been truly her vision for the story, we don't know. But I personally think that it turned into something quite beautiful.
And we originally read, I say we because I borrowed Elise's borrowed book. I think.
My library book, which I sometimes when you finish your library book early and your friend who loves books happens to live within a short distance to you, you might also pass that book to that friend.
Yeah. So that was what happened with the Monster Calls as well. I think, Elise, you had the illustrated edition and you really liked that copy as well as the story. I think, in fact, Jim Kay, the illustrator, won the Greenaway Award for his illustrations in A Monster Calls.
He did, yeah. It fascinates me that this book is illustrated because a book for a 13-year-old is almost never illustrated.
Right.
I think it just enhanced the story so incredibly. They're so powerful and really subtle.
Yeah, absolutely. And another fun fact of sorts is that we've both briefly met Patrick Ness.
Yeah.
I say briefly because it was at an author event and signing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting because I had the opportunity to meet Patrick Ness at I think it would have been the Melbourne Writers' Festival maybe 7 or 8 years ago, something like that. And I actually squibbed it because I was so terrified. It was during a period where I just read Chaos Walking and I might have read this book, and I had him on such a huge pedestal that he was standing like 7 feet away from me, and I knew someone in the festival who could have introduced us. And I had I had a copy of the Monster Calls with me that I could have handed him to sign. And I decided not to because I stood there going, what's the best outcome that can happen here? Either he says, hello, nice to meet you, signs the book and walks away, or I walk up and go, hi. And he goes, oh, God, security. And then I got really overwhelmed by the worst case scenario and decided not to meet him. But then my friend got me another copy of the book, went to the Sydney Writers' Festival and got the copy that I'm holding in my hand right now, signed by Patrick Ness, which says, for Matt, happy birthday. 2013. I have a signed copy.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah. We attended an event with Patrick Ness and do you remember who the second
the author of Me, Earl and the Dying Girl? Let me look that up now.
Jessie something, I think.
I should know that, but I can't think of it. Yeah.
So it was a a panel conversation with the two of them as part of I believe the Writers' Festival probably 4 years ago. And the main reason this sticks out in my memory is because I always feel awkward at signings. I feel like I know authors are people, but I just forget how to interact with humans when I'm getting something signed. So I think I probably had 30 seconds, if that, with Patrick Ness. I tried to make a joke, something about Sydney versus Melbourne based on something he'd said. He laughed awkwardly and signed my book, and that was about it.
So, this is what I'm getting at. That's exactly what I'm getting at. How could it possibly go any better than that?
To be fair to Elisa, I felt like he wasn't in a very good mood that night. I also made an awkward joke to Jesse Andrews. That's the name of the other author who was there. Well, his book was called Me Around the Dying Girl, so we all know what happened in the end of that book. And I said to him, because I was in the middle of reading it, so while Jesse was signing my book, I was like, oh, you spoiled the ending for me, and, jokingly. And Patrick Ness was like, oh my God, like, in a very serious way. And I was like, dude.
Do you remember I remember something else you said to Patrick Ness, Priscilla? I remember you saying something like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my memory. Something along the lines of, I've read The Crane Wife and I didn't understand.
No, I said that was very interesting, which is like, you need to read it because that's like the only thing that came to mind. Is like, this is interesting. Because it's the Crane Wife, I think, is one of his adult novels.
It is, and I didn't like it.
Yeah, see, this is why I said interesting.
It's one of the only ones I haven't read of his. So
it's not one of his more popular ones. He extended himself into adult fiction, which is fine, and I'm sure it's a fine book. It's just not what I'm into. So
I think,
with the best of intentions, I just walked past.
Yeah, I enjoyed it, but it was also a strange story. It's not like a Monster Calls where it's quite heartfelt. From memory, it was a bit odd.
Yeah, without the heart.
Yeah,
exactly. It felt like it was all allegory and metaphor without a great deal of warmth to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah.
Well, I remember Jesse Andrews was a bit more personable at that event, so I'll give Patrick Ness the night off from being super charismatic, considering how many dollars I've put towards his books over the years and films now as well. Okay, well, Patrick Ness, if you happen to be listening, I love you. Please come on the show. You're allowed to be grumpy one night. That's perfectly fine. We're all human.
We do love you, and I didn't mean what I said about the Crane Wife.
Okay. Back to A Monster Calls. Any content notes for today, Elise? I'm sure there are.
As we've mentioned, some of the specific issues that we will be talking about include grief and its impacts on a person as well as a family and the wider community. And I'll just quickly note a few additional content notes for terminal illness, specifically around cancer and chemotherapy, death of a parent, violence and bullying, and just a note that this is a very sad story. And, we encourage you only to listen if you feel if it feels right to you. Don't feel like you have to make yourself feel sad today if you don't want to listen to this. So listen at your own discretion as per usual. All right, so shall we get started with our recap and review?
Let's do it. The novel begins when a monster visits 13-year-old Connor O'Malley at 12:07. Connor isn't afraid because it isn't the monster he truly fears, the one that visits him every night in a nightmare. The monster tells Connor that Connor summoned him, and now that he has, the monster will tell him 3 true stories. After the stories, Connor must tell a true story of his own, or the monster will eat him. In the morning, Connor believes the monster's visit was another dream, but his bedroom floor is covered in leaves.
So from the start, it's very much like, is this actually happening, or is it a dream? Is it partial fantasy? What's going on? I mean, I think from the start, this was very sort of atmospheric and haunting, and it's not a super long book, but I think it says a lot with very, very few words. It sets the scene very quickly, I thought.
It is exceptionally efficient all the way through, I think. Just from a technical point of view, it's actually like reading this through again, the very first 3 lines of this book give you the entire setup for enough to make you want to read more.
I feel like Patrick Ness could win one of those 100-word story competitions really easily.
Well, certainly.
How much he pumps into just 20 words or so. Another thing I found fascinating about this opening was it's pretty clear that Connor is not particularly afraid of this monster as well, which, we don't learn all the situation from the start, but it makes you think what else is going on in his life if he's not afraid of this yew tree monster appearing.
Yeah, something is terribly wrong. The child is not afraid. The child is awake at midnight. Things aren't the way you would expect a monster story to begin.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought he was very sassy towards the monster as well.
He is really early on. He's actually quite sarcastic towards He snarks the monster really quite early on. Given that it's a sort of 40-foot yew tree that's reached in his window and grabbed him out by the leg, it's actually pretty cool of him to be this cool about it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It's definitely got an attitude.
And the only other model really is the BFG. It's the Roald Dahl story where the monster arrives and, takes him out of the window and turns out to be a lovely monster. It takes a while, but we work out that this monster is actually his friend and blah, 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 blah. So in this, it's neither. The monster is neither the antagonist that he has to defeat nor his friend. It is just a force. And he is nonplussed. He doesn't know why this thing keeps turning up. He's already got a nightmare, as we're about to discover. He's already got a living nightmare and a sleeping nightmare. He doesn't need this extra thing. And maybe that's why he's snarking about it. I don't need you as well.
Yeah. And so what that nightmare is we learned in the next chapter or so that Connor's mother is very sick with an unnamed form of cancer. We learn that she's undergoing chemotherapy, and Connor is trying his best to support his mother, keep the house in order, keep things seeming as normal as possible, and I suppose taking on a lot of responsibility for a 13-year-old.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he's getting himself up, he's feeding himself, getting himself to school. His mum is not really able to help with any of those things, and he doesn't want to disturb her. He doesn't want to put any burden on her, so he's just organising his own life.
Yeah. This is probably a good time for us to chat about the stages of grief. So, according to the Kubler-Ross model, there are 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These stages were identified based on grief felt when a person is dying, not after someone has died. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross introduced this model in the late 60s as a result of her work with people who were terminally ill, like Connor's mother. There are older models of grief which are similar, but this is one of the most well-known.
And so I suppose what's interesting about this theory is that it's seen a lot in popular culture and media. I was thinking the other day about how even something like The OC, so one of the seminal teen dramas of the early 2000s, covered the stages of grief, which isn't something you'd normally expect from a show about rich teenagers in Orange County. But I suppose what's interesting about this model is that a lot of people apply this to what happens after a person dies, so the grief felt after a person's death, as well as happening in clear-cut stages in one particular order. So moving from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance in that particular set of circumstances. And so what actually tends to happen is that people experience a range of emotions, often including these, but not necessarily including all of these or all of these in a particular order. So people often move back and forth from different stages, experience some for longer than they experience others. And this is particularly applicable when you are grieving a person who is dying from a terminal illness, and can be applied after a person's died as well, but was originally understood to happen before a person's death. And there is also a sort of 6th stage of grief as well. So Kubler also proposed meaning as being a 6th stage of grief, but I suppose that hasn't quite made its way into the popular lexicon of grief.
What does the meaning stage entail?
So it's essentially when you find meaning and understanding in a person's death. That doesn't mean that you have to like a person's death or think that it's okay or that it's understandable, but to sort of integrate it into your life and to find that it has impacted you and to sort of learn from it or grow from it. That's my understanding anyway.
That makes a lot of sense,
Yeah. And that's often the focus of work we might do with clients who are experiencing grief as well. It's sort of about helping them figure out what life might mean when a person is no longer there, and how they can work towards acceptance of that person's death while continuing on with their lives, and still acknowledging and loving that person despite their death.
In Connor's case, he experiences all of these stages, not necessarily in these orders, I believe, and we will highlight them through the rest of the summary. At school, Connor is bullied by a boy named Harry and has distanced himself from an old friend, Lily. We find out that this is because Lily told other people about his mother's illness. Meanwhile, Connor's grandmother comes to visit. She tries to talk to him and to tell him that they need to prepare for a life together. Connor tells her that they will never live together and is quite resentful towards her, and they don't really have an easy relationship at all. She's described as what's the best word for it? Sort of a modern grandma?
Yeah, she's very kind of business-like. She has a studio in her backyard where she conducts a real estate. Yeah. She's a real estate agent. Yeah. Isn't she? That's what she does, real estate work. Which I think Patrick Ness's attempt to make her the most soulless human being possible without actually being a corporate executive or a politician. But one of the things that I find really exciting early on in this book is the subversion of middle grade tropes. So one of the things you'll get often in middle grade tropes is problematic parents and grandparents who are allies. So you'll have the kind of parents are too strict and they don't get you, but your grandparents let you muck about and they're sneaky. Sometimes they take the kind of oracle figure where they look after the kids and are a good influence on them. Immediately, we don't get that. We get the opposite. His grandmother is not, he figures, not really to be trusted, doesn't like him, doesn't seem to have any empathy at all in her body. She, this is his experience of her at this point in the story. So that throws us immediately. Then you've got the best friend, and the best friend is usually your greatest ally. And sometimes in a middle grade story, you'll have a fight with that ally. Someone will do something wrong, and then there'll be a healing, and then there'll be a new order, and your best friend is still your best friend. It's a way of showing you can solve problems. In this, that's already happened, and it didn't heal. So Lily has done something terrible. She told everybody about his mum, and it has contributed to what we're about to talk about. But he hasn't forgiven her, and he won't. And then there's the bullies. The third thing is you usually get the bullies, and we have to overcome the bullies. He has to find the strength to somehow defeat the bully. And immediately we get a more thoughtful, strange bully who is just observing him. There's the kind of bullies' assistants, classic bullies' assistants, who are your cartoon one-note guys who just shake their fists and go, yeah, whenever the bully says anything. But the bully himself is thoughtful and hits Connor, that hurts him quite badly, but is more interested in him as a phenomenon than he is anything else.
Yeah. I love this line from Connor's teacher about Harry, that he says, a bully with charisma and top marks is still a bully. And she says, he'll probably end up prime minister one day, God help us all. And that made me really laugh because it's an accurate summary, I feel, of this bully as well.
Yeah, and of several prime ministers around the world currently as well.
He's definitely got some personality traits that will allow you to get ahead in life, but probably not in a very nice way.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
So we've set the scene of what's happening at Connor's school and at Connor's home life. What happens next is the monster visits Connor again and tells him the first of the 3 stories. So, and I love these stories, by the way. I think they're just fantastic.
Yeah, they're so unsettling, aren't they?
Yeah. Oh, I know. So the first story is about a kingdom. So we learn that a young prince killed his bride to prevent his stepmother from continuing to rule. The stepmother was a witch, but also a fair and a just ruler. The villagers overthrow the queen, and the prince starts to rule the kingdom. The monster says there is not always a good guy, nor is there a bad one. Most people are somewhere in between. So what I loved about this was the idea that maybe people aren't purely heroes and villains. We can have a character that might seem heroic to some, but has actually done some really horrible things to get to that point, or a character that might have something that is often seen to be villainous, like being a witch, but might also be a fair and just ruler. And Connor's quite, not dismissive, but quite sort of in shock at this story at the start. He doesn't fully understand what the purpose is. You know, aren't people supposed to be good and bad?
Yeah.
It's a question. It's a story that you could easily say, "Oh, this is a simple allegory about his grandmother." So the evil witch queen is his grandmother. You know, does she deserve punishment or does she deserve saving? And what the monster is telling him is that it's far more complex than that, and that the just result is not necessarily the fair result or the result that seems tempting, and it doesn't follow the shape of stories. I'm going to harp on the story thing quite a lot because I actually think there's a number of quotes in this book in which stories are indirectly related to what a monster is. So there's, in various places, the monster describes stories as stories are the wildest things of all. Stories chase and bite and hunt. He says stories are wild creatures. Who knows what havoc they might wreak? And he says stories can be more important than anything if they carry the truth. And that's sort of similar to the way that the monster itself is described throughout the book. So these stories are like monsters. They are forces of chaos that upend an order and force you to establish a new order, a more complex order. Just like any monster that arrives in a story needs to be slayed and a new order needs to be established.
It's very much like growing up, really, and learning that people are complicated.
Yeah, that you're resorting the simple stories you had as a child, that your parents and your world told you that there is, you know, Superman and bad guys and good guys and people are simple. And instead, at the age of 13, you're starting to learn that the world is a lot more complex than that. You're in high school now, things have changed. A more complex and sophisticated understanding of the world is expected of you. And how do you do it? Like, how do you go from the simple understanding of the world to a more nuanced and complex one?
It's very difficult to be a truly moral person.
Yeah.
If anyone who's watched The Good Place would know.
What we owe to each other. It's about the complexity of the human condition, about your responsibility for your own thoughts and actions and how those things differ.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Jade and I'm hijacking this podcast to tell you about my podcast about a book. On the show, I tell you the real story behind the world's most iconic books. So far I've done The Handmaid's Tale, Frankenstein, The Great Gatsby, and 1984 to name a few. Ever wonder why Orwell used talking animals to discuss politics? Or how growing up in Ireland inspired Dracula? And how did The Great Gatsby go from being an epic fail to one of the most praised books of all time? Join me as I uncover the wild truth behind fiction. Give it a listen on whatever platform you're listening to this on right now. And for more information, follow me on aboutabook.podcast on Instagram. Talk to you then!
Meanwhile, Connor's mother has to go back to the hospital for more treatment. Connor moves in with his grandma, unhappily. His father comes to visit from America. Connor is also resentful towards him, as his father is against the idea of Connor living with him and his stepfamily in America. His father tries to have another talk with Connor about his mother, and Connor is convinced that the new treatment will work and his mother will get better.
And this is where the Kubler-Ross model starts to sort of come in for me, as I felt at this point that Connor was experiencing some of that classic denial, almost with a touch of bargaining too, like this new treatment, it's going to work.
I don't think that the denial is helped by the fact that his mother does say, this one will work, I will get better. Perhaps she's in denial as well, or, you know, she doesn't know how to talk about it with him, which is understandable.
And everybody's denial at this point in the story is ratcheting up that anger and unfairness, that sense of injustice that's building inside of Connor. He has no control over his life. The only thing he can do is invest everything he's got in the fact that his mum has to be okay. She has to get better. This treatment has to work.
And so what happens then is we get the monster's second story. So the monster visits again. And in the second story, we learn about an apothecary who's pestering a local parson for permission to cut down a yew tree for healing ingredients. And of course, Connor goes, oh, a yew tree? This sounds familiar. That's the monster. But because the apothecary is an unlikable man, the parson continually turns him away. However, when a plague hits and many people die, the parson goes to him begging to save his daughters. The apothecary refuses him, saying he cannot help, and the parson's daughters die. The monster awakens and, destroys the Parsons house as punishment. And Connor is surprised. The monster informs him that the parson nearly destroyed the apothecary, but was willing to renounce all of his beliefs if it meant a chance that his daughters would survive.
I like the note that the monster says, you know, that the Parsons' whole career, whole life is supposed to be about beliefs, and yet he denounces them as soon as it would be helpful for him, I suppose.
This is the story that I sat on for the longest, I think. I really struggled to unwind the morality of it in my head and what it was being told for. And it is about belief and hope. But what's the message about belief and hope? Is it that you shouldn't lose it and shouldn't give it away? He says belief is half of all healing. Belief in the cure, belief in the future that awaits. And in that quote, he's actually talking about the apothecary story. But in fact, this is entirely the moral of the situation that Connor finds himself in with his mum too, that belief is everything. And it pushes Connor then to go into, I would think, even greater denial about the treatments that his mum is getting, which are getting more extreme and futile.
Yeah, I agree. This one was the one that I wasn't sure how to feel for a while. Like, I like the monster's point, but also like, if your children are dying, wouldn't you try everything? And can you blame the parson for trying?
I think this story had a trickier morality to untangle, but I think that is almost the point as well, because it really makes you think about who's right and who's wrong, and was the monster even correct in punishing one rather than the other?
I actually think the author is deliberately doing this to us, putting us in this situation where there isn't a simple answer, to say, actually, how can you cope if there isn't a fairy tale ending where the bad are punished and the good are rewarded? You know, what happens if the tale is simply that people have behaved in the way that they have and there are consequences for their behavior, and that the punishments might be arbitrary. You know, there might not be meaning to this. It may not be as simple as that. What would you do?
Yeah. So at the end of that story, the monster invites Connor to destroy the Parsons house with him, and Connor awakens to discover that he, in real life, I suppose, has destroyed many precious things in his grandmother's sitting room. His grandma comes home to discover the mess. Connor is expecting punishment, but instead she joins in and destroys the one item left intact in that room, which is a display cabinet, while she is incredibly distraught herself.
And this is the first scene that made me cry. On reread. My God.
It makes my blood go cold at first. That kind of, because I can feel it as a kid, that feeling of rage and powerlessness that puts him in this situation where he then chooses to, it's not like he has no choice. He chooses to do what he's doing. The first thing he does, even before the story begins, is break her clock. It's been pointed out that she has this antique, beautiful clock that no one is to touch. And he deliberately breaks it and sets the hands of the clock to the time 12:07, which, by the way, is when the monster shows up, always at 12:07. The line between the monster and Connor has been blurred by this step into the taboo, this transgression against his whole life and universe that he lives in.
Yeah. I love the way the grandmother's grief is described in the scene as well. I found that particularly heartbreaking, because up until that point, we've seen her as this put-together woman. This is the first time we see her unleash the depth of the grief that she must be feeling herself.
He runs out of the room and he doesn't see, or maybe she leaves, I can't remember. But either way, he's profoundly affected by this, because he starts to understand the reality of those two stories, that there isn't a simple good guy, bad guy. His grandmother has seemed like a impatient, bossy, officious person, and it turns out that she's in profound pain, which he starts to realize.
Yeah.
And I think, we obviously see Connor's anger coming through here. So this kind of externalizing manifestation of what he's feeling. And I think what's important to note here is that, just like in real life, there's often a lot of other feelings and thoughts that are underneath that anger. And anger's just kind of, anger's considered a secondary emotion. So the primary emotions that seem to be behind this are things more like sadness and fear and thoughts and feelings around like sort of resentment about the situation as well. So that's, anger rarely comes out of nowhere. There's usually other thoughts and processes that are behind it. We learn that sadly the new treatment that his mother has been undertaking isn't working, and that they're going to try one last treatment. And Connor learns that this treatment is derived originally from yew trees, again, what the monster is made of. And so Connor believes it'll work. Of course it has to work, because why else would the yew tree be visiting him if this wasn't the link and the reason why all of this is happening?
It's a classic false resolution.
And then at school, the boy who is bullying Connor, Harry, tells him that I no longer see you, having quite correctly analyzed that being seen is what Connor wants. Connor, who has been welcoming the bullying in a way, is angry at this. The monster appears and tells the third story. In this story, an invisible man is tired of being invisible. He can change his circumstances only if people are willing to see him. The invisible man summons the monster to make him visible, but discovers that there are far worse things when one is visible. After the story, the monster possesses Connor, and Connor attacks Harry, breaking his arm and nose. The school is furious, but does not expel him due to his circumstances. I think the principal says, what would be the point in that? And Connor's reaction to that decision is one of disappointment and disbelief, almost like he was looking for that punishment. He had the same reaction when his father also declined to punish him after he destroyed his grandmother's sitting room.
And he wants to be punished, we get the feeling, because of the nightmare that he keeps having. And it's not the yew tree nightmare. It's not the monster nightmare of the title. It's a different nightmare. It's the one that had him up at midnight when he saw the monster on page 1. Yeah. He was already up from that nightmare, and he won't even tell us about that nightmare in the story. Yeah. He says it's about falling and losing grip on things and hands and a cliff. But whenever it gets to the extreme bit, he won't tell us. And he all he will say is that it's what he's done is so terrible in the nightmare that he can't live with himself and he can't talk about it. He can't admit to it. But he knows he feels he should be punished. Yeah. And so his relationship to that bully, Harry, is that one, Harry sees him, no one else will look at him. Everybody excuses him from everything, lets him sit at the back of the room and do nothing in class, tells him that whatever he does is fine, that everything is fine and okay, whatever he feels and does is okay. Harry is the only person that looks at him and sees him and punishes him. He hits him and he beats him up. And the feeling that Connor always feels is relief when that happens, which is one of the saddest things I can think of. And when he finally strikes back because Harry says, I no longer see you, that's the dark night of the soul for Connor. He's literally now invisible to the entire world.
Yeah. So there's two thoughts I have around that. So one is relating to the punishment idea. So it reminds me a lot of some of the thought processes that go on if somebody is self-harming or engaging in other sort of unhelpful coping strategies. So, there's a lot of behaviors and other things that fall under the umbrella of self-harm. But in this idea, it's sort of almost like baiting somebody to hurt you as a way of punishing yourself. A very complicated thought process that goes on, but I'm just trying to simplify things for the sake of time. Maybe another driving force is his desire for some sort of normalcy. So to go, well, if I act out, there's got to be a punishment, and that's what would happen normally. If I destroy something in normal times, this is what would go on. I would get punished. I would be grounded. I would be disciplined. If I hurt somebody at school, I would be suspended. I would be expelled. Isn't that what life is supposed to be like, that my actions are supposed to have these consequences? But it's kind of existing in this this world, this style of living where it's very surreal, what he's going through, this grief, and not quite tethered to normality as he would be if his mother wasn't dying.
We actually saw that in the stories that the monster told as well. But all through the book, there are no consequences for anything Connor does. And that makes him feel all the more intangible and invisible and powerless.
a little bit more time passes, and then essentially things get sadder and sadder as happens with this story. So Connor learns that the new treatment that he was putting a lot of hope in isn't working, and Connor feels particularly angry at his mother, as he thought it would work and he believed that his mother thought this too. And then Connor goes back to the family house and actually purposefully awakens the monster and finally tells the monster the story of his own nightmare and the own story that he's essentially been telling himself. So we learn that in this nightmare, Connor is on a cliff holding his mother's hand to keep her from falling to her death. And in the end, his grip loosens and she falls to her death. And the truth of the dream is that after holding on for as long as he could, in the dream, he lets go on purpose to avoid the pain of having to hold on. And this this obviously relates to how he's feeling about his mother dying and the thought processes he's having around that, and the guilt that is coming from that as well. So that part of him that wants, is very quiet, buried part of him that wants his mother to die because the pain of holding on to her through this process is so unbearable for him and for others as well. And this guilt is really heavily underlined here. So not technically a stage of grief, but a very, very common experience that a lot of people feel, this feeling of guilt.
Yeah, he's a 13-year-old boy being asked to do so much in the face of relentless mortality, in which really from the start, we as adult readers realize where this story's going. It probably doesn't have a happy ending. Connor hasn't allowed himself that, and nobody else in the story will either. So when he finally confronts what's been going on in his subconscious, which is a representation of both his desire to have his pain end, he wants his pain to be over, and the pain of having to watch his mother die in front of him. And the monster says to him, "You must speak your truth," which is that truth. And he says, "It will kill me if I do." That's the depth of his shame that he feels about this, that his need to end his own pain is a terrible, terrible shame to him. And that's what the monster is here for. He says, "I didn't come here to heal your mother. I came here to heal you." And what he came to heal him from is his shame. That he says, "You can speak your truth," and he says, "It will kill you if you do not." And he's talking here obviously about what happens when somebody isn't able to ascribe meaning. It's why I was asking you before, Elise, about that extra step of meaning, because it allows him to ascribe meaning to his mother's life, his relationship with her and her death, to be able to acknowledge that he loved her and he had to let her go in the nightmare and in life.
Yeah.
I think it's incredibly beautiful. I could easily lose it right now just talking about it.
Yeah. I listened to the audiobook for this, and Jason Isaacs is the narrator.
Oh, wow. I love Jason Isaacs.
Yeah, and oh my God, this scene was hard to read on paper. To listen to him, scream, Mom and Connor, and just like just heart-wrenching screaming at each other. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, it's properly intense and very not very few, but it's rare, especially I think these days, for middle grade novels to take children into this fierce, primal, emotional, physical territory. There's some stories I loved from when I was a kid that were about that respected kids' anger and rage, and not in a acceptable to adults kind of way, but in a just for me kind of way, that dealt with children's rage and powerlessness and those feelings on their own terms.
Yeah. And I guess, you mentioned that meaning question before as well. I guess, I'm not that familiar with the sort of talk around that 6th stage of grief or the research behind it, but my interpretation of that is it's not so much about thinking that death has to have meaning, but about coming to terms with what it might mean for you personally. So I think there's a key thing that comes into this story is the idea of, death is unfair and it doesn't necessarily have meaning behind it in like a big fated sense. Cancer in this situation, it is one of the most grossly unfair things that happens to people. And there's absolutely no, there's no rhyme or reason why it has to affect others. It's not based on morality. It doesn't discriminate. There's obviously certain people that it affects more than others, but it can hit anybody, and that's part of being human, is learning that sometimes this does happen and it's extraordinarily awful. And when you are faced with those circumstances, it's okay to have feelings and thoughts that might feel selfish at the time, because they're not selfish, they're human. So there's a quote from the monster where he says, "You are merely wishing for the end of pain, your own pain, and to end how it isolated you. It is the most human wish of all." And the monster's actually quite comforting as well. Oh, you had that one written down.
That note literally written down in front of me. If you I would have.
The monster, who's been quite harsh and forthright at times, really sort of takes Connor under his wing in this section of the book, and talks about how human it is to hold on to multiple true things at once, and that at the end of the day, it's our actions that are more important than our thoughts. And it's important to place value on the truth of the situation and our own truths as well. So I made a comment that the monster is a bit of therapy monster at this point.
Well, this is a moment of processing, isn't it? Of ascribing meaning to something. And after all of those upturned tropes I talked about before, all the stories that went in directions that we couldn't have predicted, that upset us and unsettled us, and like monsters kind of invaded our space and acted on their own terms in a way that was so hard to understand. The monster brings it back down in the end to being about Connor's own mind. He says your mind will contradict itself 100 times a day. Your mind will punish you for believing both. And Connor says, how do you fight it? And he says, by speaking the truth, which is the very last thing Connor gets to do with his mum, is speak the truth to her. And I have a real passion about people living with the mess inside themselves and saying, you can be as tidy as you can, but we are not machines. We are messy. And that's what Connor's learning here, is that you can both want your mum to live with all of your heart and every atom inside of you, and need the pain to stop because it's too much and you're 13 and you can't cope. And so, that living with both of those realities inside his head at the same time allows him to feel himself as a whole person again.
Yeah. A lot of what the monster says to Connor at this stage reminds me of acceptance and commitment therapy, because acceptance and commitment therapy is very much about, you think hundreds or thousands of thoughts a day. They're just thoughts. It doesn't matter what you think, because they can be contradictory. And your brain is just a problem-solving machine. There's a problem, you're in pain. This is one of the solutions that it comes up with. There's no judgment in that. And I really like that. That is just a matter of sitting with the mess in your mind, I suppose, and speaking your truth about what that is.
And the ones that you choose to pay attention to.
Exactly.
Hold on to and to assign meaning to as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like sometimes I say to kids, it's okay to feel what you're feeling. You just can't hit people while you're angry, for example. You got to make good, helpful choices with your feelings.
We're right at the end of the story, so I might as well rip the Band-Aid off with the ending that we get. So,
all right. So Connor's grandma finds him under the yew tree, and they rush to the hospital. His mother is extremely weak at this point. Connor holds her and tells her that he doesn't want her to go. And then at 12:07, it is implied that Connor's mother dies.
And then we all cry.
Yeah.
Bless you for thinking that that's when I started crying. He gets to say twice to her, I don't want you to go, which honestly was a little bit of a surprise, because I thought maybe what he was going to say was, I'm letting you go. I can let you go. But he got to synthesize the thoughts in his head, the competing thoughts. I want my pain to end and I want you to live. And he was able to say one thing that told both truths. I don't want you to go. Contained in that is, I can't make you stay.
Yeah.
Which is extraordinarily beautiful. And it's just an expression of love. And his mother sees him, she opens her eyes and sees him, and she says, "I know love," or something like that. And then the monster is sitting behind him, I think, and says, "And here is the end of the tale." And oh boy,
yeah, it's a brutal ending, but what a journey that took us on. My goodness. That might be a good point for us to end our recap on before we go into our favourite moments and our ratings and overall thoughts.
Let's talk about our favourite moments. Elise, can you choose just one favourite moment out of this whole book?
It's tough, and this is definitely one of those situations where a favourite moment doesn't mean a moment that made me feel like happy and fluffy on the inside. It was, in this case, I'd say my favourite moment was probably when Connor's grandmother joined in destroying the house. It's so heartbreaking, and that scene just, it hits me really, really hard in the feels. So, Priscilla, back at you. What were your favourites?
Same. I found it really hard to choose just one, but I have to say that my absolute favourite moment was when Connor finally said out loud what his nightmare was. I thought that was very cathartic, and just again, listening to it on the audiobook was just quite the experience. What about you, Matt? What are your favorite moments?
Yeah, I'm very tempted to say the same scene, the scene where Connor finally tells his truth, and just the beautiful insistence of that scene that it can only go in one direction, and it only does, but it has to be wrestled all the way through, but since you've nominated that one, I'll actually go with let me think. I think very early on, like the introduction of the monster, I think is really exciting. The play between dream, psychological construct, and actual monster is handled so delicately as to keep us constantly thinking, what story are we in? What kind of story is this? And I'll give a shout out to the second story because it's the most ambiguous, and I really appreciated that it didn't give me any easy answers, and I still don't know what I think of it.
Cool. And let's now talk about our star rating. Okay, Elise, I think I know, but you can tell us what your star rating is.
I think this might be my first 5-star review for this these review episodes we've been doing.
I think so, yeah.
I gave this 5 stars. I think this story is really touching, beautiful, and incredibly well written. I really enjoy the overarching messages about people, situations, and morality being complex, and about being able to hold contradictory thoughts at the same time. I did really appreciate how the adults also really struggle with their own grief throughout the story, even though it was from Connor's overarching perspective. You definitely got a sense of how much they were struggling and the pain they were feeling, and how they didn't really know how best to support Connor and communicate with him too, which is very true to real life. Adults don't always have all the answers. We're just figuring things out too. I really think this is a story that should be read widely, and its appeal is not limited to young readers. And even though we don't find out if the monster's real or not at the end, I'm okay with that. I can sit with that. I'm normally the sort of person who likes mysteries to be resolved, but I think in this situation it worked for me.
Cool.
Priscilla, what about you? I think I have an idea of what your rating is too.
I'm in the same boat. I think this is actually not my first 5 stars, but it is a 5 stars. There's nothing about it that I can fault, I feel. It's just a really beautiful story about grief and how people in general are really complicated. I love the banter. I don't know if I can call it banter, but Connor is very snarky and sassy, as we mentioned before. I love the monster stories. I love that there's no black and white morals to them. Yeah. And Matt?
Yeah, I'm really usually very reluctant to give out 5-star ratings because you always want to leave yourself somewhere to go just in case the perfect book comes along. Yeah. But I honestly can't fault this book. I think it's an extraordinary book. The first time I read it was in 2013, I think, and I didn't have the same reaction to it. And I was asking my son today, I wonder why I've had the reaction I've had to it this time. And I've read it a couple of times since. But yeah, I honestly don't know. But I find it such a incredibly moving piece of writing about self-empathy and self-acceptance. about grief, about stories, about the nature of monsters. So many of my bullseyes essentially are all getting hit by this. And like I said, it's so sure-footed. You always feel as though you can trust the storyteller. Wherever this is going, I trust that he's going to carry me there safely, and all of the emotions that I'm building up as I go. And the dynamics that surprise you between him and his parents and his grandmother and the bullies and the best friend and teachers all go in directions that you would never expect, but are absolutely appropriate given the circumstances. It's like Patrick Ness has got to every point in the story and gone, this is how the story would normally go at this point, but in this kid's disrupted, awful, powerless life, given that he's had this monster visitation and given the grief that he's experiencing, what would he do? And how would this story have gone? And that makes it just about flawless. So yeah, screw it. I'm going to give it 5 stars. I honestly can't think of a reason. I've never read a review of this book. It's one of the, when I love a book, I tend not to go and read reviews because I don't want to find out if anyone didn't like it. Which is not a very enlightened attitude, but screw it. I like it anyway.
I do that sometimes as well because I just get angry at negative reviews sometimes. I'm like, you're so picky. You're clearly wrong. Like,
or worse, they'll say something that I agree with and didn't notice, and I'll be horrified then. I can't believe you ruined it by being right about something. So, no, I've never read a review, and there's probably things that you could find flaws with, but I can't, and I don't care, so 5 stars.
Speaking of reviews, my initial Goodreads review from when I read this book in 2017 was, well, that was brutal. That's it. And I stand by that review.
It's a pretty strong first response.
Yeah. There's just something about it that I just find so difficult to flaw, and I think that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. We don't need to know whether the monster is real or a fiction or an allegory or a psychological construct, and we don't need to know if there's some. You don't have to analyze everything to the point where you've covered every single possible angle. You can just love something. You can contain the multitudes and accept that it is the most human wish of all.
Yeah.
As the monster says, you can have multiple contradictory thoughts at once.
Yeah.
Exactly. Speak your truth.
Yeah. Now that we have finished our recap and review, we'll talk briefly about resources.
So on our website, on our blog accompanying this episode, we'll include a few resources about coping with grief and the impacts that grief can have on us. We'll also see if we can find any insights from people with lived experience, people who've lost somebody around this book. We didn't include any specifically in the audio for this review, but I do feel like just, if anybody has ever lost somebody, I know personally there are elements of this story that I did relate to. I won't go into any details about any specific grief experiences there, but I feel that a lot of this is quite universal with the experiences. But if we do find any book bloggers that have written about it in more detail, we'll make sure to include those on the blog post as well. And we'll also include some recommendations for other reading if you're interested in reading something similar and potentially making yourself cry again. So we would certainly recommend some of Patrick Ness's other books. He's quite a widely published author. So personally, my recommendations would include the Chaos Walking trilogy, not the movie, but the written trilogy. The Rest of Us Just Live Here is probably my favourite of his standalone books, although I have read a number of them. Patrick Ness writes mostly for younger readers. Most of his protagonists are probably in the 16 to 18-year-old age range, but I think a lot of his stories are universally relatable and very, very different genres. So I remember reading a review where someone says Patrick Ness never writes the same book twice, and I think that's accurate. He's definitely not the sort to pigeonhole himself in one genre or one type of story.
There's a book called Skellig by David Armand, which actually has a very similar structure on the surface to this book. It's about a kid who has a great stress in his life involving his mother, and I'm not going to go into too much details, and finds a supernatural entity in his backyard, along with his best friend, who he is best friends with in that story. But it follows not the same story, but it has a lot of similar aspects to it. So as a companion read, that would be a really interesting one. It's quite short.
I read that in year 7. That was assigned reading when I was in high school. That just completely lit up all those pathways in my brain of like, where do I know that from? No, I don't remember the book at all, but there you go.
Full circle, A Monster Calls is on my son's Year 7 syllabus. He did it in first term this year.
Wow. There you go. In terms of other recommendations, two others that come to mind for me in terms of similar themes around grief and sort of the emotional impact of grief. The first one is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak, just in terms of a very different story set in World War II, literally narrated by death, so it has a bit of an interesting fantasy element in there. But in terms of sort of the impacts of war and death and family and that kind of thing, I found similarly powerful, and another book that makes me cry inevitably whenever I reread it. And the final recommendation I'll give as well is one we already mentioned, so Me and Earl and the Dying Girl by Jessie Andrews. So, I mean, the spoiler's kind of there in the title, what that's about too, but a similar kind of exploration of what it means to have somebody close to you who is dying and how that impacts on you and your thought processes.
Adam Silvera's They Both Die in the End. It's a really interesting story about knowing that this is your last day on Earth and coping with that, or putting your last day on Earth to good use, I suppose. It's a really fascinating story.
Okay, well, I think that wraps us up for today. So that is probably one of the more emotionally intense books that we're going to cover this season. So hope we're all doing okay. Hope we've all got some tissues handy. Thank you, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us today. Absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I'm just wondering if there's anything that you would like to plug. Where can we find you online?
Firstly, thanks for having me. It's been an absolute treat to talk about a pretty special book to me. I would like to plug online. MatLarkin.com is where you can find information about me, Matt with one T. My middle grade book, The Orchard Underground, is out now, and the standalone prequel, The Chameleon Thief, is due out March of 2022.
Awesome. And for all of the resources we mentioned in this episode, check out our website, novelfeelings.com. We post an episode summary and links to further reading for each episode, as well as information about getting support for you or somebody that you care about.
If you like us, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to ask us a question, chat, or connect with us, you can send us a message via our website or follow us on social media. At the moment, we're on Twitter, Goodreads, and Instagram at @novel_feelings.
You can also find me on Instagram at Paith with books with an extra S.
All right, that wraps us up today. So thank you so much for listening. See you next time.
See ya.